Goedemorgen allemaal. Terwijl de laatste mensen een plekje zoeken op een van de lege stoelen, stel ik voor, gezien de tijd, dat we wel gaan beginnen. Hartstikke welkom hier op het festival Leren van Toetsen. Jullie hebben gekozen als eerste voor de keynote. Kom verder, zoek een plekje. Oh, toch niet. In ieder geval hartstikke fijn om jullie weer in levende lijven te zien. We zijn hartstikke blij dat we weer iedereen kunnen ontvangen en dat we dat hierbij in Holland mochten doen. Dat zij dus zo gastvrij waren om ons hier vandaag te verwelkomen. And now I will switch to English because the first keynote speaker of today is our international guest, Naomi Winstone from University of Surrey. She's professor there and director of the Institute of Education. And we all know her for sure because she has written a lot about feedback processes and feedback literacy. And today she will talk to us about the feedback literacy and give her recent insights on this, and she will share with us all what she knows about feedback literacy and what we can do with it in higher education. So we're really looking forward to her keynote, and we are lucky that she is here because all the festivities with the Queen this weekend, but she made some time for us to be here live via Zoom for us here. So, Naomi, are you ready?
Yes, good morning.
Then it's up to you. We're looking forward to your keynote speech. And for all here, at the end there will be time for questions. So when you have questions, keep them in mind and you can ask them at the end. Okay.
Great. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation to join you virtually today. So what I would like to do in this talk is explore this concept of feedback literacy in a way that really focuses on practice and what we can do in real classrooms with this concept of feedback literacy. So I'm going to start by just doing a very brief overview of the concept of feedback literacy and its history. I don't want to get into too much of the theory and the conceptual nature of feedback literacy because I want to really focus on the practical applications. But I am going to start with just that little bit of grounding within context. And then I'm going to explore a series of questions that I hope will give us the opportunity to unpack this concept and start to think about its application. So I want to explore, first of all, on a very basic level, why should we care about feedback literacy? And then I want to explore this idea of developing students' feedback literacy, because it's something we hear a lot as a recommendation for educators to be giving time to developing students' feedback literacy. So I want to look at what that actually means. And then I want to move towards thinking more specifically about the application in real classrooms in terms of the discipline-specific nature of feedback literacies, so that some of this work that we do to develop student skills in using feedback effectively isn't generic, isn't one size fits all, but instead takes account of the complexities within a particular discipline. And then I'm going to end by thinking about some of the barriers or challenges we might face in trying to implement these ideas within practice, and thinking about what solutions we can come up with to resolve these challenges. And then I'm going to end by setting out what I see as some of the really important future directions for research and practice in feedback literacy. So starting with a very brief history, you will probably be familiar with many of these key publications, and I think tracing the history of the term is really important in helping us to understand where we are now and where we've been. So it was in 2012 that Paul Sutton published a paper on conceptualizing feedback literacy. And in that paper, he talked about three domains of feedback literacy: the knowing, the being, and the acting. That we need to know about feedback and know about what's important. We need to recognize that feedback influences our identity and our sense of being. And crucially, feedback literacy is about taking action. It's about doing something with the feedback information that we receive. So that as a conceptual model was present in the literature. It was cited, but it didn't really have the traction that came with Carless and Bowd's publication later on. But in the meantime, we did some work around what we were calling recipients' skills in feedback. So we didn't use the term feedback literacy, but we were representing what people need to be able to do and understand in order to be able to be effective users of feedback. And I'll come back to this paper a little bit later on, because I think it gives us some important clues as to what we can do in the classroom to help develop students' feedback literacy. So a year after we published that paper came, I think, the real turning point in the history of feedback literacy. David Carless and David Bowd published another conceptual model which set out the important features of student feedback literacy, the things that enabled what they called the uptake of feedback, the use of feedback. And so they talked about the importance of, for example, being able to manage emotion in feedback processes, the importance of making judgments about quality, and how those factors feed into the capacity to take action. This paper has had a massive impact on the field, and it's already incredibly highly cited, and it's really changed the way I think we conceptualize action and the importance of action on feedback. But it was a conceptual paper, so building on that, 2019 it first became available online, but a 2020 publication date. Liz Malloy, David Bowd and Michael Henderson drew from a massive data set of the study of feedback within an Australian context. And they used those data to be able to build a framework for feedback literacy. So it's grounded in evidence. It's more comprehensive than the Carless and Bowd framework. And it gives us, again, further indication of what this concept of feedback literacy might look like. If we look at what's going on now, huge, I think we describe it as an explosion of research into feedback literacy. I'm getting notifications on a weekly basis of new papers coming out that are exploring feedback literacy. On a conceptual level, we see many different approaches now being applied away from perhaps the constructivist orientations of work on feedback literacy. We're seeing sociocultural approaches, ecological approaches, and even socio-material approaches to understanding feedback literacy. So people are applying different theoretical lenses to this problem. We're also seeing people developing new approaches to studying feedback literacy, to being able to tap into this construct and measure in some way what learners are able to understand and how they work with feedback. So recent publications focus on scales, measures, instruments for measuring student feedback literacy, and people are also exploring other tools to measure and gain insight into students' feedback literacy. And then finally, we're seeing a lot of case studies of the implementation of feedback literacy in different disciplines. So lots of examples of how classroom practitioners have taken these ideas and applied them and evaluating the impact on their learners. So the field is definitely growing. I think I'll come back to at the end what some of the future challenges might be, but we can see this evolution of a concept that has definitely had resonance with both researchers and practitioners. So the first question that I would like to ask then is why should we care about feedback literacy? Why has this concept been taken as something that's so interesting and seen as valuable? The first reason I think we do need to care about feedback literacy is that as humans, we are constantly being evaluated from very early age of our lives, in our professional world, in education, and in our personal lives as well. We often experience criticism perhaps of our cooking or of our driving. That evaluation is something we experience on a daily basis. It's also something that we experience from a very early stage in our lives. And I can remember a few years ago, I was doing a research project in schools, and I was watching the very young children, so 4 years of age, and they were playing in a big water tank, and playing with different types of materials within this big water tank. And to me, from a Piagetian background, that's exploring through play, that's learning and discovering about the world. Yet there was a teacher standing over them with a clipboard, ticking off whether they showed understanding of which things would float in the water and which things would sink. And it struck me that this moment that should have been about pure discovery and play and enjoyment was actually an evaluation task. The students were being evaluated on their abilities at the age of 4. So evaluation is something that is so common, and we tend to have this general understanding that feedback is how we improve. And if you ask people in many different contexts, what is the purpose of feedback, that is the response they'll give you, that it's how we improve. Yet feedback is challenging to understand sometimes. It's challenging to accept the feedback, particularly if it's critical. And it can also be challenging to use feedback. And I'll come back to some of these challenges a little bit later on. The second reason why I think we should care about feedback literacy relates to the fact that I think the capacity to understand feedback and to use feedback doesn't necessarily transfer across contexts or situations. We need to build domain-specific skills and knowledge that support the use of feedback in many different contexts that we encounter. So therefore, we need to understand how to develop these skills so that when we're faced with a new situation or a new domain, we understand that we need to work from that basis and not assume we know what to do. And I'll illustrate this with 2 examples. On the left-hand side there, my daughter, she's just over a year old now, but when I took this picture, it's because Bas Trimbos had sent this beautiful gift for her, saying that mum is feedback literate. And I thought, well, yeah, that's lovely to somebody to think that I'm feedback literate. Yet at the time, working with a young baby, I didn't necessarily feel that in the context of being a mum, I was feedback literate. She was giving me a lot of feedback all the time in terms of crying if I wasn't doing the right thing or if I wasn't responding to the needs that she had. And despite being apparently feedback literate in many other areas of my life, understanding her feedback was really difficult because I didn't have the knowledge, I didn't have the experience to understand what that feedback meant. And I didn't necessarily know what strategies I should use to respond. So in that situation, in a new domain, any skills I've built up for using feedback were not that valuable because I hadn't yet built up the domain-specific skills and knowledge to be able to use it in that context. The other picture here comes from something I did about 4 years ago now. At our university, every year we have a big charity event, which is called Strictly Come Surrey, and it's based on the Strictly Come Dancing programme. And in this charity event, students who are part of the Ballroom and Latin Dancing Society at the university are paired with an academic member of staff to teach them a dance, and then we all perform these in a charity event every year. And I took part in this several years ago. And again, it was a really important learning experience for me in terms of how difficult it is to use feedback in a new context. So the student there who was teaching me to dance was fantastic, and he would give me loads of feedback, very detailed feedback on the positioning of my feet or my arms. Yet I didn't really know what good looked like. I didn't know what I was trying to get my body to do to make this look like a good performance. And it's highlighted to me that part of feedback literacy is knowing where you're going so that you can use feedback to help you get there. And when you're faced with a new context, there's lots of jargon, there's lots of terms that you don't necessarily understand. And that process of being able to understand the standard you're aiming for, it's really difficult to grasp what that is. So these two examples illustrate to me why we should care about feedback literacy, because it doesn't readily transfer across domains. We need to understand that just because you've developed good skills for using feedback in one context, you still need to put in that groundwork in a new context. And that's something really important, I think, for us as educators to take into account when we have students moving perhaps from their secondary education into higher education, or even moving across different tasks and activities they might be doing within the context of their program of study. The goalposts might shift, or the criteria and standards might be different. And so feedback literacy still needs to be developed in those contexts. Another reason why I think it's important that we care about feedback literacy. So feedback is intimately tied to our identity and our sense of self. And for that reason, a lot of the time we feel like having positive feedback is validating, and it helps us to build a coherent sense of self and sense of identity. And so we're often more interested in hearing good things than bad things, for very clear reasons that are supported by psychological evidence. For example, we're much more likely to actively seek feedback from people that we think are going to be positive about us. And we're much more likely to seek feedback in areas or on skills where we think we do well. So we have this tendency to seek out the validating information. And whilst we might recognize the importance of critical feedback in helping us to improve, we're more reticent to get that information because of how it can affect our sense of identity. So evidence that we are selective in the type of feedback information that we might want to receive. And part of feedback literacy is being able to understand the value of critical feedback and how that can support our future development. I'm analysing a data set at the moment which is looking at the experiences of students doing sandwich degrees. So in the UK, a sandwich course is one where they do 2 years of their academic study at university. They then have a year working in their industry or in their discipline in a professional sense before returning to university to do their final year of study. And what we're looking at is how that year in the workplace influences how students then approach feedback when they return to their academic study for their final year. And we're seeing something that is illustrating this development of feedback literacy in terms of wanting the critical feedback, wanting the more unpleasant truths. So the students are saying that having experienced feedback in the workplace, they're really experiencing the value of critical feedback. And it's been really tough for them in the workplace. They've had very public criticism, but that's really helped them to build the skills to respond to that and be able to manage that process. And then they're saying that when they come back to university, they want that critical information far more than the praise and validation, because they've had the experience and the opportunity to develop an understanding of why that's valuable and what it can do for them. So that's a really nice illustration, I think, of feedback literacy and how it can develop. We also need to be able to engage with difficult information and critical information. But we know that there are all sorts of defenses and biases that block our receptivity to feedback. And this is something that I explored with one of my colleagues, Rob Nash, in a piece we did for the BBC a few years ago. And what we did was reviewed psychological literature that illustrates a lot of the common defenses and biases that get in the way of our openness and our receptivity to feedback. And we found across the literature that actually we have a lot of defenses, we have a lot of tools for protecting our identity and our self-esteem in the face of criticism. And some of these defenses, these biases, are completely unconscious. We may not even realize that we're blocking feedback or not being receptive to feedback. So here's another reason why feedback literacy is important. We need to support our students to be able to recognize these defenses and biases and overcome them, so that that critical information that can really support their development is something they're much more open to. I've got one more reason why I think we should care about feedback literacy. One of the studies that we did a couple of years ago was with 16 to 19-year-old students. So in the UK, students who were studying for their A-level qualifications prior to university. And this was a large questionnaire study where we measured their self-reported use of feedback, so the extent to which they say they engage with and make use of feedback. We also measured various traits and characteristics in the students, such as some key personality traits and their achievement goal orientation. So whether they are striving for mastery goals to really understand and learn about the subject for its own sake, or performance goals where they were seeking to learn in order to improve relative to some kind of external standard relative to others, for example. And we also measured various beliefs about feedback. So people's willingness, volition to use feedback, their belief in the utility of feedback. And what I think is most important for feedback literacy, their self-efficacy or their confidence to use feedback. Do they believe they have the ability and the skills to use feedback effectively? Now, what we found in this study was that various characteristics and traits relate to self-reported use of feedback. So students who were pursuing mastery goals had a much stronger orientation with mastery goals, reported using feedback to a greater extent. And students who were higher in the personality trait of conscientiousness also reported greater use of feedback. Perhaps that's not surprising, because some of the key elements of being conscientious include things like striving for achievement, which definitely would be supported by use of feedback. But what we found in our analysis is that these relationships between characteristics of the individual and their use of feedback were mediated by their beliefs in feedback. So, for example, students who were higher in conscientiousness reported stronger volition to use feedback, which in turn related to greater use of feedback. In the same way, belief in the utility of feedback and having a stronger sense of why feedback is important also mediated the relationship between these characteristics and use of feedback. And so did self-efficacy. So one of the reasons why students with higher conscientiousness, for example, make greater use of feedback is because they feel more confident in their skills and capacities to use feedback effectively. We also found that neuroticism, that sense of anxiety in students, was negatively related to their use of feedback. So students who were higher in neuroticism, they reported lower confidence in their ability to use feedback, which in turn led to weaker use of feedback. So what I think I take away from this research is the importance of confidence, the importance of helping people to feel that they have the skills and they have the capacity to use feedback effectively. And what we can do in the classroom then helps to build this confidence. And that can mean that depending on people's characteristics, we can help them to become more confident and therefore make greater use of feedback. So moving on then, what does it mean to develop students' feedback literacy? And this is certainly something that we hear a lot in terms of calls on educators to do this, to put aside time to support the development of feedback literacy. But what does this actually mean in practice? So I'm going to return to that systematic review that I mentioned right at the beginning that we published in 2017. And we had two aims in this systematic review. The first was to review the literature on the factors that influence students' engagement with feedback. And those were factors related to the individual themselves, their characteristics, factors related to the giver of feedback, their characteristics, their position and status, factors related to the feedback message itself, so the way in which feedback is constructed, how that influences engagement with feedback, and also the factors relating to the context in which the feedback process occurs. So we reviewed evidence on those factors. The second thing we did was to review published studies that reported some kind of intervention or classroom practice with the aim of improving students' engagement with feedback. And for each of those studies, we looked at the author's rationale for the particular practice or intervention that they reported. And what I mean by that is we were interested in what kinds of skills they were hoping to target through their intervention. What was it aiming to do? Because we wanted to uncover the basic processes that underpin effective use of feedback. And we called these recipient skills, so the building blocks of effective use of feedback. And based on that analysis of what authors were trying to do through these interventions, we came up with 4 key feedback recipient skills. The first is self-appraisal. So to use feedback effectively, we need to be able to look critically at ourselves, and we need to be able to evaluate our strengths and our weaknesses, and we need to be able to think about how we can harness our strengths to help improve our weaknesses, for example. So it's that willingness to look at ourselves in a critical light that is really key to using feedback. The second skill is assessment literacy. So this is the capacity to take the perspective of an assessor to understand standards, performance standards, criteria that are being used for assessment, and to understand what good work looks like. Because if we don't have that understanding of standards and we don't know what good work looks like, it's very difficult for us to use feedback to help us get there. The third skill, goal setting and self-regulation. So in order to use feedback effectively, we need to set ourselves targets for the use of feedback, and we need to monitor our progress towards reaching those targets and perhaps adjust our strategies if we find that one of the things we're trying to do is not working and we need to shift and try something else. And finally, we need engagement and motivation. So we found that a lot of studies in our review were simply trying things out to try and get students to be more willing to look at feedback in the first place. And so there's this basic motivational element to using feedback, where we have to be willing to engage with that advice and put in the really hard work that's needed to implement feedback and see the impact of engaging with feedback. So what we then did was we mapped these 4 recipient skills against the different kinds of interventions and strategies within our review, so that we could see what kinds of practices in the classroom could help to target each of these 4 skills. So these are the different interventions that we found in our review, and I'm not going to talk through all of them, but I'm just going to point out a couple that from our review, the evidence suggested were particularly effective, and also that students themselves felt would be particularly effective. So one of the things that we looked at was the operation of a feedback workshop. So some kind of classroom session or activity that helped students to build the skills needed for effective use of feedback. Another one that students felt would be particularly beneficial was a feedback portfolio. So the opportunity to collate all of their feedback together and to synthesize the key messages coming through their feedback and use that as a basis to support the actions that they take to implement the advice. Now, a lot of the interventions that you see here are things that are done commonly in classroom practice. So things like peer assessment, engaging with grading criteria or formative assessment. And what this demonstrates is that there are many things that as educators we do anyway that can be easily repurposed to support the aim of developing students' feedback literacy. It doesn't necessarily require fancy or complicated interventions. We can simply utilize some of these core techniques that we have and explain to students that the reason we're doing this is to help develop the skills underpinning feedback. Now, feedback workshop was something, as I mentioned, that came up as being particularly promising in terms of developing students' feedback literacy. So on the basis of our systematic review, we worked with a group of students to develop a toolkit of resources that can directly support the development of student skills for using feedback. And we called this the DEFT, the Developing Engagement with Feedback Toolkit. It contains 3 components: a feedback guide, which the students wrote, containing advice and strategies for other students to help them with using feedback. It then contains a set of activities and resources, worksheets, to be able to build a feedback workshop, the opportunity to have a session where students can practice some of the strategies for using feedback effectively and gain feedback on those strategies and hopefully build confidence in their ability to use feedback effectively. And finally, it contains the building blocks for a feedback portfolio. So the opportunity for students to pull all of their feedback together to be guided through some reflection and goal setting activities on the basis of their feedback. Now, the toolkit is freely available to download from the Advanced HE website, and everything's downloadable as Word files so that you can freely edit or translate the resources for use in classroom practice. Still sticking with the idea of how we develop feedback literacy in real classrooms, I thought I'd share this paper from Bianca Maleka, David Bowd and David Carlis, where they talked about how we can embed the development of feedback literacy within the activities that we do within the classroom, so within our common practice. And they pulled out 4 key strategies that we can do and embed within our practice to help develop student feedback literacy. The first is the use of interactive cover sheets. And this is a way of students diagnosing their own needs for feedback and therefore requesting feedback on specific elements of their work. So with an interactive cover sheet, you may well be aware of these. When students submit work, they're invited to fill in a box saying how they've used feedback from previous work to inform the current submission, but also to request feedback on specific elements of their work from the marker, from the assessor. And so it is encouraging self-appraisal because students have got to look at their work before submitting it and identify where feedback would be most beneficial for them. And then to be able to request from the marker what they would like feedback on. The second strategy they talk about is self-assessment. So the importance of giving students the opportunity to evaluate their own work as a way of developing the capacity to generate inner feedback that can further develop feedback literacy. They talk about peer assessment in a particular way and how it can have value in developing feedback literacy. So they see value to ongoing cycles of peer review where students provide feedback to each other on a draft of their work. But importantly, they include within the process rebuttal or a response to that feedback so that student A provides feedback on the draft to student B, but then student B responds to student A with how they are interpreting the feedback, how they might use it, or perhaps things that they don't understand or don't agree with. And it's that response and ongoing cycles of peer feedback that they argue really helps to develop student feedback literacy, because they are having to use that feedback and think about it in a very detailed way rather than just reading it in a surface way. And finally, feedback portfolios. So they talk about the importance of students curating and synthesizing feedback so that they don't just treat feedback on one task or assessment as a one-off event, but instead they're charting their own development and progress through feedback, helping them to see how the strategies they've used for engaging with feedback are having an impact on their ongoing learning and development. So there's, again, practical strategies, ways of using feedback and applying feedback literacy that we can do within classroom practice. So building on that, just delving a little deeper to think about disciplinary specific approaches to feedback literacy. Things like our toolkit are sort of add-on interventions, add-on resources. So it would involve perhaps scheduling a separate workshop or encouraging students to complete a feedback portfolio in their own time. And we know from a wide variety of evidence within the literature that those add-on approaches are not as effective as approaches that are fully embedded within the normal educational activities within a program of study. And so we've been thinking about how we can harness students' learning within each discipline to help them understand the importance of using feedback. So we published a paper last year on discipline-specific feedback literacies, and I'm just going to share with you the background to this because I was inspired by the work of a colleague of mine, Rob Nash, who teaches psychology at Aston University in the UK. And he taught a large first-year unit on social psychology. And what he chose to do in that unit was at the end of each lecture, he would have introduced a new theory or concept within social psychology. He reserved the last 10 minutes of each lecture to look at research that showed how that theory or that concept helped to explain people's engagement with feedback. So he fully embedded engagement with feedback within the content of his module. And within social psychology, there are lots of theories and concepts that really link nicely to feedback, such as identity, such as group processes and in groups and out groups. So there was a really nice synergy between the disciplinary topic and this concept of using feedback. So he did that. He then gave students a workshop on feedback based on the toolkit halfway through the module. And then the assessment that students were asked to do also incorporated feedback literacy. So students were asked to write an essay on their own engagement with feedback using the theories from social psychology that they've been learning about within the course to explain their own behaviour. So it was a nice application task where the content, the disciplinary content that they've been learning had to be applied to understanding and explaining their own engagement with feedback. And I thought this was a really clever way of using the discipline and the content within the discipline to help students learn about feedback and the importance of feedback. And that made me wonder whether this could work in other disciplines as well. So we reviewed what are called subject benchmark statements in the UK. They're published by the Quality Assurance Agency, and they're the closest thing we have to a national level syllabus for each course within higher education. And so we analysed these for content that students were learning about that would be an opportunity to embed the development of feedback literacy within their learning of disciplinary content. And these are the 5 areas that we found within this analysis. The first is responding to task briefs and client requirements. So we found that there were lots of disciplines, more design-based disciplines, things like architecture or computer science, where one of the things the students had to learn about was the ability to interpret a task brief from a client, to produce something in response to that brief, and then deal or manage with the feedback from the clients that would tell them how they needed to modify what it was that they'd produced. So this is a really nice example within these disciplines where as students are learning about the way they'll respond to feedback in their future as a professional, we can talk to them about how they can use feedback in their educational lives, why that's important, how to respond to critical feedback, and how to manage that process of receiving critique. We then had a group of disciplines where it was very clear that as part of the courses, students were having to develop the capacity to reflect upon and evaluate their professional practice. So this was very common in healthcare disciplines, for example, where the capacity to reflect and self-evaluate was a key professional skill that students were learning about. And again, it's a really nice opportunity when talking about how they will have to reflect continually upon their performance in the workplace, how they can do that with their coursework and their work within university. Promoting behaviour change. So there are lots of disciplines where students learn about strategies for helping other people change their behaviour. And part of that process is providing feedback to people on their behaviour and their progress towards goals that they might be setting for themselves. So again, if students are learning about how to help somebody manage their weight, for example, is a really good learning point there, that if the person they're working with doesn't take their feedback on board and doesn't change their behaviour as a result of the feedback, they're not going to meet the goals that they've been set or that they've set for themselves. So again, a nice synergy between the disciplinary content and opportunity to talk about and get students learning about the importance of acting on feedback. The mechanisms of learning and helping others learn to develop. So this came from disciplines such as education, where students learned about the very process of learning, and psychology, for example, as well, another example. And here we see feedback coming up as a concept in its own right, in terms of how the brain learns through feedback, for example, or how we need to use feedback to help other people develop their skills and strategies. So again, opportunities there to talk about feedback and to help develop students' feedback literacy in the context of learning about these key concepts. And finally, we had a theme which we called learning about cognate concepts, because there are many examples within the disciplines of where things related to feedback are part of what students learn about. A really nice example is in engineering, where the term feedback and feedback loops has a whole meaning within the context of that discipline. And when students are learning about feedback loops and that regulation of systems, again, we can talk about how feedback loops operate in education and how regulating behavior through feedback has parallels to some of these concepts they're learning about. So this was our attempt to take feedback literacy from this general thing that applies to all students to what it actually means within a discipline, and how we can harness the content of a discipline to help embed the development of feedback literacy within the curriculum. I've got one final example around developing feedback within the concept of a discipline and thinking about how that works for different types of students. So I mentioned from our systematic review that one of the things that was seen to be particularly beneficial and effective was the use of a feedback portfolio. And we developed the basic building blocks of a feedback portfolio in our toolkit. But what we then did was developed those basic elements into an online portfolio, an electronic portfolio, which we co-designed with students, and it was called the Feedback Engagement and Tracking System, or FEATS. And what this enabled students to do was to collect all of their feedback digitally in one place, and to synthesize that feedback using a tagging process. So each of the comments that was entered into the portfolio, they could tag against a list of academic skills, so that they could then ask the system to pull out all of the comments they'd ever received relating to a particular skill, but also to see at a glance which skills were coming up most frequently in their feedback as things they needed to develop or things that they were doing well. And this is where the discipline-specific element came in, because that list of key skills could be tailored to the discipline. So the list of key skills in a subject such as sociology, for example, would be very, very different to the list of key skills in a subject such as maths. And it was enabling students to look at their feedback holistically in a way that made sense within their discipline. The second part of the toolkit was also customizable for different disciplines. This was a skill development tool, which is essentially a large resource bank. So based upon the feedback synthesis of what students were seeing as the most important skills they needed to work on, they could then go into this skill development tool and look at articles, do activities, listen to podcasts, or book onto workshops that help them to develop those specific skills. And finally, the portfolio contains an action planning tool, which is a way for students to set targets and goals for how they're going to use feedback, and then use that as the basis for dialogue with a personal tutor or an academic advisor. So there were elements of disciplinary customization built into this portfolio. And in the initial version, this is what the dashboard looked like. So when students logged in, they could see how many bits of feedback they had integrated into the system. They could see at a glance how many times particular skills were coming up in terms of things that they'd done well or things that they need to improve. And they could also see how many outstanding actions they had within their action plan. Students reported that they found this approach and using the portfolio to be organic and personalized. And I think part of that is because it was tailored to the discipline, and it helped to highlight to them the kinds of skills that they should be developing. It also helped them to feel that they could take responsibility for their learning, and also to take the steps that they needed to implement feedback. So the final question to address then is what are the barriers to the implementation of feedback literacy, and how can we help to overcome them? Now, some of the clues, I think, to the barriers to the implementation of feedback literacy come from Elizabeth Malloy's paper that I mentioned right at the beginning, where they used a very large data set to build an evidence-based framework for the components of feedback literacy. And in the discussion section of that paper, they talk about two challenges that they envision to the implementation of feedback literacy. The first is shifting teachers from information providers to facilitators of learner feedback literacy. So changing the mindset and changing the positioning of teachers in terms of what their responsibilities are. And the second one, appropriately embedding feedback literacy. So this was some of the challenges that they saw within their data, where educators felt that they didn't have time to give attention to the development of feedback literacy because they were focused on covering the content, and said there just isn't time within the module or the unit that I'm teaching. There's too much content to cover. I can't focus on feedback literacy. But also not necessarily feeling like they had the competence to develop students' feedback literacy, that was quite a difficult and maybe specialist task, and they didn't feel they had that ability. So I'll just unpack these two a little bit as we come to a finish. So I think this is a challenge because regardless of an educator's individual mindset, an individual approach in terms of what they do in feedback processes, wider systemic factors are at play, which really do emphasize this transmission model of feedback, where educators provide comments to students, and that is the model of feedback. thinking about student feedback literacy and their use of feedback is a very different model of feedback, where the responsibility of educators is to facilitate students learning through feedback rather than simply providing comments. And I've got some evidence as to why I think this positioning of educators as the transmitters of feedback rather than facilitators of student learning through feedback is so dominant. So some of the work that I've done with David Bowd, comparing practices in the UK and Australia, has shown that if you ask people how they know whether their feedback has been effective, the most common response is based on whether students were satisfied or happy with the comments that they'd provided, rather than responses that showed an awareness that we see the effectiveness of feedback in terms of what students do, not what they say about feedback. If we want to know if feedback's truly been effective, we should look at whether there are changes in students' behaviour or their learning. But our evidence suggested that the effectiveness of feedback was really evaluated in terms of how well it had been transmitted or how well it had been provided, and whether students were satisfied with that. On a policy level, educators tend to be positioned as providers of feedback and students as passive recipients of feedback. So earlier this year, I published an analysis of learning and teaching strategies for 134 UK universities, as well as their teaching excellence framework submissions. So this is a lovely process we have in the UK, another form of regulation, where universities are graded as gold, silver or bronze on the excellence of their provision. And part of that process is the submission of a narrative outlining their practice and their strategies for learning and teaching. So when I looked at these documents, it was a large data set, strong evidence of teachers being positioned as providers of feedback and students as being on the receiving end of comments. There was very little that represented this idea of students as being actively engaged within feedback processes. And finally, a study I did with Ed Pitt and Rob Nash, we asked a group of educators to tell us what they saw as their responsibilities in the feedback process and what they saw as the responsibilities of their students. And we saw the dominance of this transmission, transactional model. Most commonly, educators would say that their responsibility was to provide clear comments. And most commonly, they would say that the responsibility of their students was to receive or read those comments. So again, it's focusing very much on the teacher as information provider rather than facilitator of student feedback literacy. So the challenge then in overcoming this is to reposition educators and students, to represent them within policy, within practice, in the ways that focus on student feedback literacy and students' involvement within feedback processes. Another layer of complexity in this is the way in which we evaluate the effectiveness of feedback in terms of student satisfaction. Now, in the UK, we have the National Student Survey, which is a very prominent high stakes evaluation from students, which feeds into national league tables, for example. So it's something that we place a lot of emphasis on. And what we did in this study was we looked at national student satisfaction surveys from 10 different countries. And the items that related to feedback, we were interested in how students were positioned within these. Were they positioned as on the receiving end of comments, or that were they positioned as having a more active role within feedback processes? So various different elements of coding. I'll just share one with you, which was where we looked at the implied role of the student. Did the items imply that the students had a passive role within the feedback process or an active role? And what we found here was that by far the majority of items across countries positioned students in very passive ways. So for example, here's an item from the UK National Student Survey. I have received helpful comments on my work. Not only is that positioning the educator as information provider, it's also implying that the role of the student is merely to receive those comments, not necessarily to do anything with them. And then there's a contrast from the National Survey of Student Engagement in the USA, which positions the student as having an active role. So how often did you discuss your performance with a faculty member? So again, another challenge for implementing feedback literacy is not being driven by the measures that are implying we should be focusing on how we deliver comments. We need instead to foreground the importance of student involvement and their active involvement in feedback processes. Responsibility is another key challenge, that if we want to talk about developing student feedback literacy, whose responsibility is it to ensure that that takes place? And I've got two comments here that really illustrate this, this divide or this passing of the blame between educators and students. So the first quote here comes from a student in one of our focus group studies who said that it wasn't their responsibility to engage with feedback because they were paying for it. And so the consumer model of higher education, where in the UK students pay very high fees for their education, was actually a barrier to them feeling it was their responsibility to behave in a feedback literate way. And I find this quote even more ironic when I say that this was an economics student who was saying this about the paying for feedback and why that wasn't their responsibility to engage with it. In contrast, here's a quote from an academic member of staff in an interview study that David Carlis and I talk about in our book. And they said that I assume that students are educated enough to deal constructively with feedback they receive. Otherwise, they should not be at my university anyway. And this is quite an extreme view. I think not all educators would necessarily agree with this, but it does illustrate a belief that we shouldn't have to develop students' feedback literacy. They should just know how to do it anyway. Otherwise, they shouldn't be in a higher education institution. So this passing of the blame and whose responsibility is it is a really key problem that I think needs to be resolved. And I've got a suggestion as to how we do that. So finally, embedding feedback literacy, I think, requires us to really understand the reasons why students find it difficult to engage in a feedback, to behave in a feedback literate way or to engage with feedback. And this was something we explored in a focus group study with students, where we didn't ask them directly about why they find it difficult to use feedback, but what we did was ask them to look at some real feedback comments and talk about what actions they would take on the basis of the comments. And this naturally led to a discussion about why they would find it difficult to use these comments. And we found 4 themes or 4 barriers to students' engagement with feedback. The first was awareness, and this represented students understanding what feedback was even for in the first place and why it was important, but particularly what the feedback meant. And they found it quite difficult to understand or decode the comments that were being provided on their work. And that was a very basic barrier to them taking further action if they didn't even understand what the feedback meant in the first place. The second barrier we called cognizance, which really represents knowledge of what kinds of strategies you can use to implement feedback. So you might know that there's some feedback you need to use, but what steps do you actually take in concrete terms to put that feedback into practice? And students said they didn't always know how to do that. And I think that's why things like feedback workshops are really beneficial to build students' confidence and knowledge of these kinds of strategies that they can use. The third barrier we called agency, and this represented whether or not students felt they were in control of being able to use feedback. And a common challenge here was where they had done a task in one module or unit, and by the time the feedback had been returned, it wasn't useful for a task that they might be doing in another module or unit. And so they didn't feel that the assessment design was giving them the agency to use that feedback. And finally, volition. students were quite honest in saying that sometimes it just felt like too much hard work to use feedback, and it wasn't really a big priority. And I think that's a core challenge to the implementation of feedback literacy that links back to assessment design and how we build in opportunities for them to use feedback so they can feel they have more agency to do so, and also more motivated to apply that feedback. So how do we overcome these barriers? I think we do that by sharing responsibility with our students and recognizing that developing feedback literacy and using feedback effectively is something that educators can't support on their own and that students can't do on their own. There has to be joint responsibility. And I'll illustrate what I mean through this framework, which talks about shared responsibility for overcoming each of those barriers I've just mentioned. So we have a triangle representing the educator's responsibility in the feedback process, and we have a triangle representing the student's responsibility in the feedback process. And they're the same size, recognizing that it's 50-50 shared responsibility for making feedback effective. But depending which of these barriers we're trying to work on, the relative balance of responsibility between educator and student is slightly different. So for example, with that first barrier of awareness, knowing what feedback means even and what it's for, we argue that the balance of responsibility there rests with the educator to make their feedback clear and to have conversations with students about what feedback means within the context of their discipline. But there's still a responsibility for students here, and that responsibility really represents the fact that they need to ask if they don't understand what the feedback means, so that they can then be taking responsibility for resolving that barrier too. In terms of cognizance, we argue that the relative balance there also rests with the educator to help students develop these strategies, for example, through feedback workshops, so that they do have a toolkit of strategies that they can use to implement feedback. But there's still an important role for the student here, that they have to choose which of those strategies to use in any given situation and ask for guidance if they find that the strategy they're using isn't working, or they're not sure how to proceed. And we argue that if as educators we take we do our bit in terms of building awareness and cognizance, we can then shift the balance of responsibility to the student for overcoming a sense of agency and volition. So in terms of agency, students need to recognize that there may not be simple transfer from this assessment they're doing now to the very next one that they're doing. That transfer may come later in time, or it may be that they can use feedback to help develop broader skills rather than just applying it to a piece of work. But there's still an important role for educators in terms of designing assessments in a way that support that, and also signposting transfer opportunities to them. And finally, volition. By its very nature, students have to take the balance of responsibility there in terms of being willing to put in the hard work that's needed to use feedback effectively. Still an important role for educators, though, in terms of explaining why that's important and creating environments where that's rewarded and valued for students to be engaging with feedback. So, the future, we have this horizon of feedback literacy in terms of research and practice. Some of the things that I think are going to be really important in the future. The first is moving towards measurable outcomes of feedback literacy. And by that, I mean, what is the impact of engaging with feedback? Can we gain insight into what works in terms of developing students' feedback literacy in terms of measurable outcomes? So changes in behaviour, changes in learning, how can we gain insight into what works? The long-term impact of feedback literacy is also something that I see as being particularly important. So we can look at the shorter term impact of whether something we do helps to develop students' feedback literacy, but how is that sustained in the longer term? And how does it transfer into the workplace, for example? I think we also need to look at how students' self-reported feedback literacy relates to their behaviour, because we can use self-report measures, but if we don't know how valid they are in terms of representing students' actual behaviour, they're not so useful for research. And finally, I think we need to look at interventions to support feedback literacy, not in a one-off way, but in a much more sustained and cumulative way. So, for example, how does what we do to support the development of students' feedback literacy in the first year of their programme then relate to what we might do in subsequent years? And how do we build on those skills and strategies and help students to transfer them across different domains and different tasks? So huge scope, I think, and potential for the field of feedback literacy. And it's going to require joint effort in looking at the theory and the concepts, but also the practice and how we can measure and evidence the effectiveness of the practice. So thank you. I will leave it there. I would just like to acknowledge the funders of my research and the research assistants who've supported the work that we've been doing. And I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Naomi. It was a very insightful and complete overview of the concept of feedback literacy. And you mentioned the DEFT toolkit for the audience here in the room. The colleagues from Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences have translated parts of the DEFT toolkit to Dutch, and it is shared in the learning network Feedback Literacy from our platform. So if you not already joined the learning network, send us an email and we can add you to the Teams group and you can find those documents. Okay, are there any questions for Naomi?
Hi, Naomi. All of you shared here looked for me as if it was about students in higher education. So I believe they will be older than 20 something. And I was wondering, is there also research done that is more related to the younger group of students, so like between 15 and 20 years old? Because I'm very interested in that. So maybe you could mention some resources where I could find how it works in that age group.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right that the majority of research focuses on higher education, but there is some work looking at sort of older school children, so sort of 16 plus. We've done some of that work in our lab, and we actually worked with a local college to develop a version of the toolkit for school education, and that's available on my Learning Lab website. If you search for the Surrey Assessment and Learning Lab, the resources are available there on that website. Younger children, I think, is really important because I think we need to build this understanding about feedback from a very early age, and what we've seen really is that one of the practices in UK schools certainly is called dedicated improvement and reflection time, or DIRT, and this recognises the fact that pupils aren't going to learn from the feedback that teachers have written in their books if they don't have time to implement it. So dedicated improvement and reflection time uses class time for students to directly use feedback they might have been given. So even a much younger child who perhaps has done a piece of writing and they've had feedback on that writing, they will then be asked perhaps to redraft part of that writing using the feedback, or to carry out a particular exercise to practice something that they've been told they need to improve. So that kind of thing is going on. It's not referred to under the umbrella of feedback literacy at all, but I think it's trying to do a similar thing, which is give learners the opportunity to work with feedback and to apply it directly. In terms of emotion, I'm aware of a book, a storybook that was written for really quite young children called Thanks for the Feedback. And it's a story book that helps them to understand why feedback is important, why it can be difficult to use. And there is with that a teacher's resource pack with activities that can be done with much younger children to help them understand about feedback and why it's important. So on a practical level, yes, but research, I would say, is much more limited within that context.
Okay, yeah, because I'm very interested in if there's also, because they are, yeah, in an age that they are starting to get very self-conscious and with all those social media where they really grade each other on all the different kinds of levels, and that they, what I experience is that they are a bit hesitant in saying what they think and see feedback as a positive thing instead of that is very difficult. And I was wondering if there's also because of their brain development or other social or psychological elements that would influence if they could really become feedback literate. So I was wondering if there was already research done. So because I'm very interested in that. But thanks for what you already gave.
Just quickly, there is research from neuroscience showing that children and teenagers do process sort of reward-based and error feedback differently to adults. But it's a really nice example of where that literature is not necessarily connecting with the educational literature, because it tends to be feedback in terms of this is right or this is wrong, like reward or punishment feedback, rather than the kinds of richer feedback that's used in an educational context. It's much harder to do the neuroscience research with those kinds of comments, but yeah, I think you might be right that there is some information there around processing that would be really valuable for educators.
Yeah, thank you very much, Naomi, especially also for the striking example of being a young mom. I think a lot of people, moms and dads, can relate to that. I was wondering, because I think a lot of the research is done in settings in which giving feedback is already normal. And at home, I have a lot of discussion with my husband, who is a teacher at a university, in which it's archaeology, so the setting or the discipline is also important, I think. While I am a teacher at the healthcare, University of Applied Science in nursing. How do you overcome the difference in the view on giving feedback, like in the cultural, is it the cultural aspect? I don't know, but of more teaching and explaining and being, sending the message to the students instead of using feedback. How have you any advice to overcome that kind of cultural differences between higher education? How's it called? Organizations.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point you've raised, which is the feedback culture. And I think there are national feedback cultures, the way that feedback operates in particular countries. So, for example, I have a colleague whose background, he previously worked in higher education in Germany, and he says how feedback is just not such a big thing there. Students don't worry about it or criticize it as much as they do in the UK. So there's national feedback cultures, but there are also disciplinary feedback cultures and local feedback cultures. And that's an important thing that students have to become part of, to understand how feedback operates in a particular context or a particular university. So one of the things that I think can work really well is at the beginning of a program of study to have a conversation, a discussion, even produce some kind of charter or document representing what feedback will look like in that particular program or even that particular module or unit, so that those expectations are shared and built from the start. Because it may be that even within the same course, a very practical hands-on based module, feedback will look very different to another module that same group of students are taking that is much more technical. And so rather than thinking they're getting different kinds of feedback across the two and it means that one isn't as good as the other, we can help them to understand why it needs to be different across those two contexts. So I think it requires dialogue and it requires setting expectations for what feedback will be, what it will look like, and what are the responsibilities of students and of their teachers in that particular context in making feedback effective.
Thank you.
So there is time for one final question. Who can I give the microphone? Oh, up there. Wil je even doorgeven?
Hello, Naomi. I'm a teacher educator at Radboud University, and I'm wondering, for your own professional environment, how normal is it for you to do feedback like talks with your colleagues? Because I think you have to set an example as professionals among each other, so your students also can learn from your professional dialogue. Can you reflect on that, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important thing that we need to do. We need to demonstrate different approaches to feedback. So some of the work that I do is involved with supporting new lecturers in higher education, and I will often sit with them and go through their feedback that they've given to students, and sometimes that can be really valuable in that I might sort of play devil's advocate and say, well, what were you trying to say here? What does this mean? I'm not sure I would understand it. And they might say, well, I know exactly what I meant. I wrote that comment and it was really clear. But encourage them to see things from the other side. I think there's also real value to bringing students and teachers together to talk about feedback. So a colleague of mine took this approach where she would get students to talk about feedback they'd received and how they understood it, and ask the person who wrote the feedback to talk about what they meant. And then she brought them together so that they could talk through the feedback together, and really useful for both sides to kind of see what was valuable, what was understood, what was misunderstood. The other thing I think we can do is share with students and with colleagues our own feedback experiences. So this is a strategy that I've started doing with my students, is showing them examples of feedback I've had on my writing, for example, through the peer review process, and telling them how I felt when I got those comments, and then how I worked through those emotions and used them to be able to respond and enact the feedback. And they're really surprised, I think, sometimes to hear that we receive really critical feedback, and to also hear that somebody who is a professional and who knows a lot about feedback still gets defensive.
You're the professor.
I still get angry and I can't look at it, and I have to come back to it in a couple of days. And a student said to me, "What, are we allowed to do that? Are we allowed to wait until we read the feedback?" And so I think modeling and sharing our own experiences is really powerful, and can help develop students' feedback literacy.
Thank you very much.
So once more, Naomi, thank you very much for this talk. We really enjoyed it. And everybody here, thanks for joining. The slides and the recording will be shared on our website. And have a nice day at the other workshops and keynotes. Thank you.